Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest today is Melissa Gomez, a jury consultant, and we're talking about the Bill Cosby guilty verdict and what this can tell us going forward about the way jurors think about cases involving political corruption, corporate malfeasance, and sexual assault. The world has changed since Bill Cosby was convicted, and the world around us has changed in keeping with that decision. So it's a fascinating conversation inside juries' minds from one who's spent a lot of time working with jurors. You won't want to miss this conversation. Thanks. My guest today is Melissa Gomez. Melissa is a jury consultant and the president of MMG Jury Consulting LLC. Melissa, thanks very much for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
We had a historic jury verdict not far from here in Montgomery County in Norristown a couple of weeks ago. Bill Cosby convicted on all counts of sexual assault after his first trial the year before ended in a mistrial. And I know that this has become a study point to really understand something that's going on in courtrooms and with juries all across the country in cases involving not only sexual assault, but issues involving corporate greed and corruption. And you have written about this and you have studied this. So we're going to talk about that today. It's very, very important what's happening in courtrooms across the land. So before we get into that, though, Melissa, tell us a little bit about yourself. You are the first jury consultant we've had on Good Law, Bad Law, and I know people can watch a very popular TV program that focuses on jury consultants, but may not really know much about what you actually do. Mm-hmm. So give us some background on that.
Sure. So my background is in psychology. I have a PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And what my focus is how people learn, how they behave, how they make decisions in social contexts, specifically in the context of being a juror. And so what I do is I work with attorneys and I work with witnesses and I work with corporations or plaintiffs. I work on all different sides of litigation in order to help those people in litigation who are involved in a case and need to present a case to a jury, understand the perspective of that jury, understand what's important to them, what are the messages that they want to hear, and how are they going to be looking at a case from that outside perspective, which may be different from what we see as people who are actually involved in the litigation. And so there are several different ways that I go about that. Sometimes it's helping to pick a jury. Sometimes it's helping to prepare a witness testify, managing their own anxiety and own lack of familiarity with the process, and just also doing some research and trying to understand how historical issues, how local issues may be affecting important juror perceptions and how that may affect your case.
Now, I've been a trial lawyer for more than 20 years, and I often say to my clients on the very first meeting, when we're just meeting for the first time, we are on trial starting today, because absolutely. I am starting to think from the very first moments of thinking about the case, how am I going to tell this story in a courtroom before a jury? How is this story going to play? How is my client going to be received by a jury? So I'm thinking about that from the beginning, shaping the story, looking at what facts are going to be important, thinking about the hard facts, the soft facts. It sounds like that's the kind of thing that you can get involved in and assist a client from the very earliest stages. We think of the jury consultant as helping pick a jury, but really it's understanding a jury through the life of a case, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And the life of the case is really the process of developing a case, is the process of making a case ready to try in front of a jury. And so we think about what's important to a jury. What are the facts? What are the issues? One of the things that I help my clients do is take a step back, because there are really two kinds of messages that are sent in a trial. One is the content message, which is what you're talking about. What are the facts? What's the evidence? The other issue is what I call the image message. How would the jury describe us? What adjectives would they use? and the way that we present ourselves, the way we present our story, the way our witnesses present themselves in the case, how does the image that we reflect, those bigger picture messages, either enhance or distract from the evidence we're trying to present?
What images in what sense?
Images in what sense is, so you mentioned Bill Cosby, right? And so the image, I think that one of the important, very important issues for Bill Cosby was that the issues that what he was being accused of was in such stark polarization from the image that he had presented to the world for years. If you think about the Cosby Show, he was a champion for women. He was a champion for Black women. So not only did you have an African-American family, a professional African-American family, in a popular show in the 80s, but you also had one of the strongest characters was his wife. I think her name was Claire Huxtable on the show. African American, strong,
Doctor.
Beautiful. She was a lawyer, actually.
She was a lawyer.
The
He was the doctor. That's right. It's been a while.
And so it has. And so there was an image that he was a champion for, I mean, look at what he's presenting. He was progressive and pro-woman, pro-strong, powerful woman. And then behind that, what was happening in his personal life? Right. And so so when you think about, so this is the image that he had out there in the world. What was he presenting in the courtroom?
Right.
What was he presenting in terms of the messages that were being sent by his trial attorney? And it's very interesting that what I understand is that in closing arguments, his lawyer was very aggressive, attacking the credibility, attacking the accusers as being on a bandwagon for their 15 minutes of fame. And if you think about with an image of someone who had been a champion for women's rights, and then this is, in contrast, the message about women that's being sent by his attorneys, or also just the fact that he was very silent. He didn't testify. His image was someone who had always been a spokesperson. He was
for pudding.
For pudding,
yeah.
And for Temple University, and for, we saw him out. He was not someone who was seen to be quiet. He wasn't hesitant to say what he had to say. Yeah. Well, why is he so quiet now? So, I mean, this was particularly an issue in this case because of the public image. But even in your everyday litigation, where you're not having a well-known celebrity, you're not having something that's out in the news, what are the image messages that are being sent by, let's say a corporation, a David and Goliath type of case? Are the people representing the corporation seeming like they don't want to follow the rules of the courtroom? Are they not answering the questions? Are they being aggressive, setting forth their own agenda instead of asking the questions that are being, answering the questions that are being asked? That would present an image message of a corporation that doesn't follow the rules. It does whatever they want to do.
Well, and let's pick up on that. We can perhaps start with the Cosby case because it's significant, and you've written about this and have thought about this and have done some research on this too, in addition to just your experience working on hundreds of cases over the years, hundreds of trials. There's something very unique that's going on in our culture right now. And the timing of Cosby's first trial, which ended in a hung jury, the jury could not reach a decision one way or the other, and his retrial recently where he's convicted. Something's going on in our culture. We know what it is. You argue that this is having an impact on the way people perceive those images and how they get past, say, the superficial presentation that an individual like Cosby makes to get at what is really going on.
Right. It's about power.
Right.
Power.
So you have a very powerful celebrity in Bill Cosby.
Right.
A very powerful man as well, who's accused of some pretty horrible things in how he's treated women. So describe a little bit of what you see going on in the cultural landscape, and maybe some spilling over into our political landscape too, in this crucial time period between his first trial ending in a hung jury and the trial that just ended a couple of weeks ago.
Right. What I'm seeing is the opposite. I think it's the political landscape that may be bleeding into our social landscape.
Okay.
And so what I'm seeing is happening is since the transition of political power, there has been a great shift in jury decision-making and in jury verdicts that I have seen. I started to see it anecdotally, thought it was very interesting, and then I started to collect data in order to see is what I'm observing, is it measurable? And so what I'm talking about is sometimes as a part of what I do, we'll conduct what's known as mock trials. Yeah. So it's almost like market research. So instead of going and checking out Coke versus Pepsi or looking at a new product, we bring people, eligible jurors, into a room as a mock jury, as a sample jury, as a representative of a jury that may be in a case, and we present a case to them. We present the trial to them so that we can get their feedback and understand from their perspective, how are they seeing this case? And through that, I collect data. And so what I've been seeing is that there's greater emotionality, there's greater polarization, and there's a lot of mistrust in power establishments. And I'm seeing that mistrust in not just power establishments like a man like Bill Cosby, and it's not just power establishments like our government, but it's also power establishments like corporations, like manufacturers, those kind of institutions that people perceive as having power over the little guy. And so what I'm seeing in cases is that there is a lot more distrust.
That's a key word. That's the word I was just thinking of.
Right. It's distrust.
Yeah.
And it's not only distrust in, for example, for products, as to whether or not the product has risks or is dangerous, but what is being communicated to the community. So what are you giving to us, number one? What kind of power do you have over us? And what are you telling us about that? Are you misleading us?
Well, right. And so, I mean, we'll bring in an example from corporate life in a second. But just if we stay with Cosby, going back to what you were saying about this image, what he's really saying is, trust me, Bill Cosby, Mr. Huxtable, the pudding guy.
Correct.
The guy who did the voices for Fat Albert when we were kids, trust me that I'm not the person who would do the horrible things that these women are saying I did.
Trust my image. Don't look behind the curtain.
Right. And then going further and saying, not only trust me, but don't trust them. You should. So it really does come down to trust. And when what we see is more and more people who you'd have thought would command a great degree of trust, proving to be untrustworthy. Right. Whether it's Matt Lauer, someone millions and millions of people watched every morning and probably had good Q ratings or whatever they call those, that people like him, they like listening to him, they trust him. Right. Harvey Weinstein, a powerful movie executive. People in Donald Trump, who says those women are lying. Don't believe them. Trust me.
Well, that's one of the amazing things about this whole issue that I'm seeing is that you have the mistrust in politics. What's political scandal going on? Mistrust in corporate malfeasance. Mistrust in the sexual aggression issue. And our president exemplifies the trifecta. He's been accused of all three.
Yeah. But you talk about something in your article that I think is very important, and you alluded to this earlier when you mentioned polarization. Right. So you said there's a couple of things that you're seeing going on: higher emotionality I want to know a little bit more about what you mean by that. But also greater polarization. We see, we talk about polarization in our politics. You're either it's us or them. I mean, I've listened to Brene Brown, who I think is fantastic and talks about this issue. We become more. It's either you're with me or you're against me.
Right.
You're either, and we've seen that increasingly in politics. How does that play into the way you think jurors are thinking about and deciding cases where trust is such a big issue?
It's an exact replica of what you're seeing in politics. So you're either for me or against me. So we used to see more consensus. We used to see more compromise. And now there's a lot, the emotionality and the polarization go hand in hand. People are polarized in their position. They're digging in their heels. They're becoming more emotional and angry about the issues. So they're more polarized because they're more emotional about it. And you're also seeing this in some of the current verdicts, the damage awards, so that when you have people in those strong emotional positions, but everybody's in the same direction, their damage awards, the money that they're going to award in trials, is more emotionally driven, which drives those numbers up. And so I'm seeing more failure to compromise, failure to come to consensus, like we saw in the first Cosby trial, versus everybody's on the same note and let's send a message here,
right?
Which may have been the second Cosby trial,
right? Well, sending a message is a powerful thing that a jury can do.
Right.
I mean, I think every lawyer who's ever given a closing argument will in some way allude to the idea that a jury sends a message.
Right, and that's what we're seeing.
Send a message that we're not going to allow someone to just come into court and bring down a good company, or don't, send a message that companies can't put money over safety. We're all crafting the message that we want the jury to send. So what is different, do you think, now that there does seem to be a higher awareness, a greater level of emotion, and polarization, and it seems like a higher level of distrust. You can't just look at a Bill Cosby or a Matt Lauer or any of these other figures who've been brought down or have certainly been are facing accusations. The New York Attorney General, who was highly regarded for his work as Attorney General, brought down because just a couple of days ago because of allegations about how he conducted himself in his relationships. It seems like the wall of trust that we might have assumed, you can't assume anymore.
Correct. Now it's jurors are almost approaching these cases. Actually, they are approaching these cases now from a perspective of mistrust. And it's, why should I trust you? Not, all right, plaintiff, or not prosecution. You prove me why I should mistrust this person. It's, all right, we have this mistrust in establishment now. Why should I trust you? What is your affirmative story? And so while initially the legal purpose of lawsuits was to, let's look at this case in isolation, let's look at the evidence in isolation, and the jury has to decide whether someone is liable or not liable, guilty or innocent, in one specific instance. And now what we're seeing, and I have actually collected, this is one of the things that I collected data about, was, do jurors see their job as more of deciding a case in isolation, deciding just really being the trier of fact, deciding what facts are true, what facts are false, what's, who's right, who's wrong, or is their most important job to send a message to society? And what I'm seeing is that most jurors that I have polled, think that their key role is to send messages to society, to say what changes they want to see in their community. And part of that may be, especially in venues, in urban venues that tend to be more liberally oriented, to tend to be on that side of the political spectrum, are saying, well, you know what? If our vote isn't going to be our message. If that's not going to have any effect, well, then maybe this verdict will.
It seems like one of the things that is a part of what's happening in juries now, and you've looked at this, and we're kind of dancing around it, but I think it's there in what we're talking about, is if you don't trust somebody, or if somebody is not trustworthy, it's not a far stretch to say they're lying. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you about the role of people's perception that somebody is lying in these cases. You mentioned the Cosby strategy, and it's not a brand new innovation, to attack the accuser.
Right.
This has been something people have been talking about in the world of sexual harassment and sexual assault cases, going back to Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. Mm-hmm. The person who steps forward and is the accuser is then turned on.
Of course.
She dressed that way, or she was provocative, or she's making it up, or it's just for money, or, there's something about her character that shows that she shouldn't be believed as a strategy to defend the one who's accused. Now, and you can bring in your research too on this, I think, where you look at what people think about those that once we trusted, that they're lying. Mm-hmm. I've many things that we write and submit to the court have had an opportunity to say the other side's position is based on false statements, misrepresentations, right, mischaracterizations, but it would really take a lot for me to say the other side's lying, because that feels like a much stronger statement to say. So I wonder, from the standpoint of cases that go to trial, lawyers take positions. Of course, if a case goes to trial, there's one side, and then there's the other side. And we let the facts come in, and the jury decides who's right. But now we look at these cases, and it isn't just that the accuser in the Cosby case was found to be right and Cosby was found to be wrong. It's really that Cosby is lying about what happened. Mm-hmm. Right? That seems to be something very central to how, how people are approaching these disputes differently now.
Yes, but I think there was also a very important difference between the first and second Cosby trial. Mm-hmm. Not only were we dealing with a different political climate in terms of the whole Me Too phenomenon, but we were also dealing with the fact that in the second trial, there were multiple accusers.
Yes.
So it was about one person, but the judge allowed, I believe, 5 other women to testify about their experience with Cosby as well. So I think so what you're talking about in terms of the mistrust of the accuser, what was she wearing, what was she doing there, yeah, that was one of the issues in the first trial. One of the reasons why they came to a mistrial is that there were a few jurors who were saying, what did she think was going to happen? Mm. She's going there by herself. She's wearing these clothes, and she's, what did she expect? She had to, it was consensual, because otherwise there was no other reason for her to be there in that context. Right. So just because of this mistrust in politics and in power, just because now there is not an inherent trust in someone like Cosby, doesn't necessarily mean that there's an automatic trust in the other side. Mm-hmm. The Me Too movement and these issues don't erase that skepticism. What it does is it gives the platform, it gives a greater level of trust that, maybe the fact that it's been so many years isn't as big of a deal, because now we're hearing about lots of allegations. And so the importance and the trust is really in the consensus. And I think with the undercurrent of Me Too, the fact that the second Cosby trial dealt not just with one accuser, mm-hmm, who was effectively picked apart in the first trial. Now you've got consensus. Now you've got 6 similar stories. It's the same thing with Weinstein. It's the same thing with Lauer. When there is one single accuser, yeah, it doesn't look like a pattern of behavior, that difficulty still exists. But now when there is consensus and a power of behavior, now we're going into this is just another example of abuse of power. We're seeing it all over the place.
So, I imagine, and I've seen this in some of my cases too, it is a defense strategy whether it's a company or an individual accused of something, to try to separate out and make it just about an isolated incident.
Absolutely.
Let's not bring in evidence of those other cases.
Absolutely.
Let's just focus on this one here. And that's very prejudicial to the accuser because there is credibility in the numbers.
So what's the message if it's an isolated? So if it's about jurors sending a message to society, well, and it's just one isolated incident. Here's your message: is that no one ever makes a mistake, that there's never a problem, that there's never one product that goes wrong, that there's never should be anyone who ever gets sick while using a product. But when you see the pattern, the message that the jurors want to send becomes more prevalent. Right. And that's what the whole issue of punitive damages. Damages
to punish.
Mm-hmm. And to tell other companies, don't do this.
Right.
But what I'm seeing is that when they see a pattern, when they see a bigger social issue, jurors will be punitive and will find other ways to be punitive, even in cases where the court doesn't allow that category of damages in the case.
So if there is credibility in numbers, and it seems kind of obvious that should be, the Me Too movement then probably would have an impact on juries, because in the small confines of the courtroom where the Cosby case was tried, you're right, you have not just one woman's experience with Bill Cosby, you have 5 or 6 women's experience. But you also have that set against the backdrop of what's happening in the society at large.
Consensus within society at large.
Right.
Correct.
So that lends credibility. In the days of Anita Hill,
right,
it was very unusual. You didn't hear about this. If you were a woman, you knew about it from your own experience, but it wasn't talked about openly the way it was in a very public way during the Clarence Thomas hearings.
Right.
And now, really a generation later, whether it's in Hollywood or in the news media or in Washington in politics, more and more women coming forward, does that lend credibility generally to somebody who would come into a courtroom in an individual case like as happened in the Cosby case? I
believe it does. So, you had mentioned that I had written about these issues. And when I was writing about these issues, I wanted to understand the historical background of, as I said, the trifecta: political scandal, corporate malfeasance, sexual harassment. And when you look at political scandal, back to the 1700s, when you look at corporate malfeasance, you're looking at stories back to the 1800s. Yeah. The first incident of sexual harassment I could find in our history was Anita Hill. Mm. That wasn't very long ago. When you're thinking about the history of that is likely the reality. And when we were looking at more of these sorts of relationships and sexual scandal, it was more about affairs. What were the affairs? Well, maybe that was what they were calling them. And so when you talk about political scandal, when you talk about corporate scandal, there has been consensus. It's not a stretch for people to believe, because it's been a part of our society for so very long. Mm-hmm. Now we're getting to the point where the sexual harassment piece is also becoming more. This isn't a surprising issue. This isn't an isolated incident. Now we're understanding that there is consensus in the community that this is a problem that happens. But still, when you're taking a look at an isolated incident, it's the credibility of both sides, it's the image messages of both sides, and who they're going to trust, because there is a level of distrust, I think, on both sides. Yeah. But where the accuser now is bolstered before they were before is that it's no longer just the fact of the allegation is no longer unusual. The fact of the allegation years ago is no longer automatically dismissed, because this is now something we've heard before.
And I wonder, now that Cosby's been convicted, he and his legal team in the first trial use this strategy of, trying to tear down the accuser, and
Right.
then
They
tried
were
the same
using the
strategy.
polarization strategy. It was, I think, I would guess that if I was a fly on the wall in that room where they were trying to decide what to do, they're in a polarized society. Let's try to polarize it and see what happens. And it didn't work.
Well, but it had worked. It had worked for a long time, right?
Yes.
I mean, in many other kinds of situations, in many kinds of cases, in many other, again, politicians have done it, celebrities have done it, people in the news media have done it. Oh, that's just somebody out for money. It didn't work in the Cosby's case, and I wonder now, against this background where as a society we are more accepting, it is more talked about, more victims do step up and speak about their experience, and this strategy of tearing down the accuser having failed so miserably, and I think what may be the first real test, in this modern era, in this Me Too era we're in, and it failed. It's not just that Cosby lost. The strategy of blaming the accuser failed here. So, do you think that will have an impact on jurors in cases going forward?
I do. I mean, I think that strategy of lashing back at the accusers with that kind of venom, with that kind of anger, likely is not going to be effective anymore. But I think that there may be natural inclination to still be skeptical, especially when there's just a single accuser. And there are ways that a defense team may try to take advantage of the inherent skepticism without coming across aggressively. In a case where your client is being accused of violence and aggression, the last thing you want to do is show the jury aggression.
Yeah.
That's the image message. They personified the aggression. Now, but there is a way to pick apart the story in a way that isn't aggressive. Yeah. So it's the strategy that's used, the evidence that's in front of you, the consensus versus a single accuser, that trial teams are going to have to look very closely at in determining how are they going to defend these cases, and whether they face how much of an uphill battle they face moving forward. Which now you have consensus of the community. Cosby had consensus within the courtroom, and then you had a strategy that personified what he was being accused of, which clearly was an issue for him.
Well, we've talked really about individuals facing these kinds of accusations, but you've mentioned this, and your research explores this, I think, in a fascinating way, because it isn't just individuals that get accused of wrongdoing. Corporations do, whether it's defective airbags, there's a big litigation involving that, or a dangerous drug that causes a lot of harm. And here we're talking about the powerful in our society in a different way. Drug companies, insurance companies, chemical companies, information companies like Facebook. We maybe blindly and naively trusted Facebook, and now we find that perhaps we were lied to, we were deceived. And your research looked at that, and you can tell us about it, but specifically I thought one of the more telling findings from what you looked at is that people are more inclined today to believe that a company, that a manufacturing company, like a drug company, let's say, lies to the public, not just has a different point of view or has something to say about safety and this, but is actually lying to the public about their products. So tell us a little bit about how you got to that finding, and what you think the significance is of that finding.
So how I got to that finding, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I do in my work is I conduct research. We'll do mock trials, and some of the cases that I work on involve manufacturers who make products and are accused of having a defective product or not being honest about their product. And so I've collected data over the years. And so what I had done was I took this this one piece of data where I asked jurors, do you agree or not agree whether or not companies lie about their product safety to the public? And then I split the sample into what's been happening over the past 18 months versus what I had been seeing historically. And I saw in my data it was about a 17% increase of people believing, almost half of people believing in more recent times that companies lie about their product safety. And I think there are several different issues that have to do with a shift in our cultural climate that have to do with that. Number one, same thing as the Me Too, media exposure. In the media, there have been many substantial verdicts and issues in the media about products causing illnesses.
You mean reporting on verdicts?
Reporting on
Covering these
verdicts and
cases,
right,
yeah.
reporting on verdicts or reporting on these issues. It's kind of like started with tobacco, and that story has been told over and over again in different contexts with different. A lot of times it's the drug manufacturers, medical devices, those kinds of things where the story seems to be repeating over and over again, where there's a product that a company is making and there are risks that are found to be associated with that product, but the corporation doesn't disclose that, doesn't give the consumer informed choice. And then if that person then realizes that risk, has an illness, the whole Vioxx, a higher association with heart attacks, then that spurs on the litigation. And I think that story is also now becoming repetitive. There's starting to be consensus in that story. And I think there's also another element that we're seeing of there's a great reliance that we have on products, on medications, on things that we use. And also with the advent of social media, things like podcasts, things like Facebook, there's also a greater expectation of transparency. You should be able to get any piece of information at any given moment at time because, right there on your phone. And that has now become an expectation. And so when there is information that a company holds and doesn't make available on that device that you hold in your hand and can find anything about anything, that expectation is violated. So what I'm seeing in these cases is that it isn't necessarily that people think that products should be fail-safe. People understand that not every, there are risks associated with things.
And that companies are in the business of making money.
Exactly.
There's not news
no
either.
one begrudges that. Everybody wants, commerce and capitalism and employment of other people. That's important to everyone as well. But inform us.
But it seems that from what you're saying that this is a significant shift, and maybe there's a way to analogize it to the way people think about the accuser versus the accused in say, a sexual assault case like the Cosby case, I should say the Cosby cases. I'm thinking, as I'm listening to you, about the McDonald's coffee case, which I think is one of the great misunderstood cases in litigation history, by the way. And there's an excellent documentary on it that really explores behind that case and why it has been used by business and the Chamber of Commerce and other interests to try to, convince people and state legislatures to enact tort reform across the country. But that's another story for perhaps another day. But the McDonald's coffee case at the time, and I think there still are strains of this in the way people think about that and have processed that into the way they think generally about cases that go to court in this area. Is there something wrong with the person who is complaining or is bringing the case, and less of a focus on the company that caused that to happen in the first place? And I wonder if, since that time, and I think it's been, 20 or 25 years since that case, maybe longer, that there's a shift, perhaps because of some of the things you point to, social media, media coverage, popular attitudes in other areas that have jurors, which is to say all of us, because we're all potential jurors, more focused on the responsibility of the company and whether they've fulfilled their responsibilities, even if you have feelings one way or another about the person who's bringing the case, now the focus shifting to what the company is representing about itself.
I think in this topic, we're actually shifting more from the political polarization issue, which it's still an undercurrent, but to a generational issue.
Okay.
So in that, in those times where it was really what was the focus on the individual, there wasn't an expectation of the same level of communication and the same level of transparency that is expected now, because information wasn't as readily available on our fingertips. But as the younger generations are growing up, the generations that grew up with cell phones, that grew up with the internet, that grew up with that level of communication. Now, a lie is not just me telling you something that isn't true. A lie is me not telling you something that might affect you, the way that you would perceive something or affect your behavior. And I think that's how I interpret that data, is that do companies lie? Well, no, they're not lying. They're just not telling us. And that's the same thing.
That's a sin of omission.
It's a sin of omission.
Yeah, interesting. Well, where do you, look ahead a little bit. You've talked about some examples where we're seeing big verdicts, jurors making a statement, sending a message, looking at the changes in the political landscape that we've seen in the last couple of years, the Me Too movement, social changes that we're seeing. Do you see these trends continuing in cases? And what do you think this means for celebrities like a Bill Cosby, or companies like a big drug company, for example? You might be in position to advise them on how to shape their message and how to shape their image and deal with the perceptions that are out there and growing. What do you think this says about where we can see these types of cases going in the future?
I think that these types of cases for the defense, when you're speaking for a corporation, when you're speaking for a powerful entity, the focus used to be, did the plaintiff prove? Did the prosecution prove? We as the defendant don't have to prove anything. And that is the law. But from juror perception, when you're dealing with a community that cares about the bigger societal messages of how does this affect me? What is this important? What do you represent as a power establishment to my community? I think that an affirmative story needs to be told, and not just an affirmative story of they're wrong, they're lying. It's why should you trust us? As a power establishment that now serves with an undercurrent of mistrust, why should we be trusted? As telling you the truth as jurors, as being a good member of the community, of caring about our consumers, of actually, for Bill Cosby, I actually do live the values that I projected in the 80s. And I think without that image message, it's going to be very difficult for defendants in these breach of power kinds of cases to overcome that undercurrent of distrust that's happening. It's not impossible, but it's becoming more difficult for them because they're starting from that vantage point of mistrust.
See, I think too, and I wonder what you think of this. I think a big factor in all of these cases that we're talking about, all the cases certainly I know that I'm involved in, a big theme is accountability. I say this somewhat humorously, but I think there's a lot of truth to this. When Ronald Reagan was negotiating with Gorbachev, he said, trust, but verify. And this goes both ways in the social media world that we're now in. A plaintiff bringing a case, if caught on video or having posted something to their Twitter account that contradicts the message they're trying to, portray in a case in a courtroom in front of the jury, they're going to get hammered for that.
Absolutely.
And the same for corporations. Bill, the other thing that I think was powerful in Cosby's case is he'd been given he gave a deposition in a civil case, which was allowed to come into evidence in his criminal case, where in his own words he talked about getting drugs to give to women, and got those for the very purpose of giving to women. I don't think that did him any favors, because here again, his credibility is undermined by his own words. So you say, hey, trust me, but here's a problem with that trust.
Right. And can you imagine Cliff Huxtable getting drugs to give to women?
Right.
I mean, that's where sometimes the good image of celebrities can I think it had a negative impact on him, where if you have a political figure or you have a celebrity figure that doesn't have that kind of squeaky clean image, it's not as shocking.
Yeah. It's the hypocrisy factor.
Exactly.
A congressman who's, talks about family values from the stump, but then is caught on tape with a little boy in a bathroom.
Right.
I mean, that really goes to the problem of trusting somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the ultimate challenge and the ultimate test is accountability. Can you, if you can be accountable for your action, then I think a jury is going to be very sympathetic to that. But whether you're a doctor or an insurance company or a Hollywood celebrity or a big corporation, it just doesn't seem like these things can be taken for granted anymore, in anywhere near the same way that once they were. And I think it's a powerful message from the research that you've done. So with that, thank you.
You're
this has
welcome.
been really fascinating.
Had a great
thank
time.
you so much for being on the program and for sharing your insights into these important issues.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right.